So Zane Hodges, in his book, the New Testament was originally written by its inspired authors in the Greek language. Through many centuries until the invention of printing, about AD 1450, it was handed down in handwritten copies. These there now survive approximately 5,000 copies or partial manuscripts going way back. The two most popular editions of the Greek New Testament in use today are those produced by the United Bible Society's third edition and by the Deutsch Bibelstiftung, the Nestle-Aland Text, German, 26th edition. These two texts are nearly identical. Let me just underline this and blow it up. Although eclectic, both rely heavily on a relatively small number of ancient manuscripts that derive mainly from Egypt. Among those, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus are the most famous uncial large letter manuscripts. The most important papyrus witnesses in this group of texts are the Chester Beatty papyri and the Bodmer papyri. These may fairly be described as Egyptian. Egypt almost alone offers climatic conditions highly favorable to the preservation of very ancient manuscripts. In contrast to this kind of text stands the form of text found in the vast majority of the remaining documents and has been appropriately designated the majority text. And it comes up all the time, but the problem with that is later discoveries, more accurate things, don't overrule the majority many times. The witnesses to the majority text come from all over the ancient world. Their very number suggests that they represent a long and widespread chain of manuscript tradition. The most ancient manuscripts of the New Testament were written in all capital letters, uncials, and these later were replaced by the so-called minuscule script, in which everything was written in what today might be called lowercase letters. In minuscule texts, the beginnings of sections were often marked by larger letters, a practice reflected in most current printed Greek texts by capitals. Comfort, in his work that we cited, contrary to the common notion that many of the early New Testament papyri were produced by untrained scribes making personal copies of poor quality, several of the early New Testament papyri were produced with extreme care by educated and professional scribes. So you just have to investigate, which he's done. Paleographers have classified handwriting styles from the 3rd century BC to the 4th century AD and beyond. Many of the early New Testament papyri were written in what is called the Reformed documentary hand. The scribe knew he was working on a manuscript that was not just a legal document, but a literary work. Papyrus on Oxyrhynchus 405 was divided into sections according to a system also found in the great 4th century manuscripts, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus. This system clearly was not created by the scribe. Furthermore, this manuscript, written in handsome script, displays 3 different positions for punctuation as well as omission and quotation signs. The paleographic evidence reveals that several of the early manuscripts were copied carefully with precision and acumen, undoubtedly affected by Alexandrian scriptural practices. The early New Testament papyri contribute virtually no new substantial variants. So I repeat myself, the early New Testament papyri contribute virtually no new substantial variants, suggesting that all of the New Testament variants are preserved somewhere in the extant manuscript tradition. It's Kenyon, 1958-55, says, the number of manuscripts of the New Testament, of early translations from it, and of quotations from it in the oldest writers of the Church is so large that it is practically certain that the true reading of every doubtful passage is preserved in some one or other of these ancient authorities. This can be said of no other ancient book. This is very important. Sheer quantity and the accuracy of it. We have a reliable New Testament. You have any questions about the Old Testament? I don't. The New Testament quotes largely a lot of the Old Testament inaccurately. This tells us that it is very unlikely in the New Testament that we would find additional significant variant readings if other manuscripts were discovered, even if these manuscripts were from the 1st century. We can safely assume, then, that the original text has been preserved, usually been preserved in the earliest manuscripts. Comfort goes on to say, there are several manuscripts that are quite accurate copies of the original text. Most of these were manuscripts produced by early Christian scribes in Egypt or by Christians influenced by Alexandrian scriptural practices. Goes on to say, as the most ancient of textual critics of the New Testament, they were probably in a better position to produce a good copy than modern textual critics, even though the latter have far more manuscripts at their disposal than the ancients did. The ancients have had many manuscripts dating from the 1st and 2nd centuries. The ancients were just as capable in evaluating the quality of manuscripts as modern critics are, and they were much closer to the text, especially with respect to familiarity with the language. F. Bruce. The text of the Greek Testament, established by B. F. Westcott and F. J. Hoyt, Westcott and Hort, and published with an explanatory introduction and appendices in 1881, introduced a fresh and more scientific method of classification. Classification according to textual types or families. This classification has the further advantage that it includes not only Greek manuscripts, but also the early versions in other languages and New Testament quotations in ancient authors. Isn't that amazing? We can pretty much produce the whole New Testament by the writers and authors, contemporary authors of the time, without looking at the New Testament, because they quoted it to one another in letters. Westcott and Hort were pioneers in this matter, and their classification has been corrected and expanded. But classification by types of text has been established as the most rational and fruitful classification of the evidence. So what did you say in Greek? What did you say in German? What did you say in French, or whatever languages, in Egyptian, Phrygian, in those days in the 1st century? All those languages, they copied to other languages so that other people of other cities and so on around the area could read it as well. The great centers of Christianity in the early centuries intended, in the course of copying and recopying, to have distinct types of text associated with them. Textual students have been able to distinguish among other sources of evidence for the New Testament text groups of manuscripts, versions, and citations associated in particular with Alexandria, Caesarea, Antioch, and the West. And the West means primarily Rome. The Alexandrian type is represented in particular by codices N, B, and C, and a few other uncials and minuscules. Here's footnote number 1. Also by the Coptic, Bohairic version, and by biblical citations in the Alexandrian writers Origen, Athanasius, and Cyril. The works of Origen, however, reveal the use of two types of biblical text. When this was first pointed out, as it was in 1924, by B.H. Streeter in the Four Gospels, it was thought that the year 231 in which Origen left Alexandria for Caesarea marked the time when he exchanged the use of Alexandrian types of text even before he left Alexandria, and that he certainly used the Alexandrian type of text for a time after he went to Caesarea. Then, when the Chester Beatty papyri were discovered and studied, it appeared that they too constituted a witness for the New Testament text which Streeter had called Caesarean, so that this text was current in Egypt in the first half of the 3rd century, that is to say, in the time of Origen. But wherever it originated, this text was certainly used at Caesarea and radiated from there, and it may continue to be called the Caesarean text. It is the text which was used in the Gospels at any rate by Cyril, Bishop of Jerusalem, in the middle of the 4th century. Its chief representatives, in addition to the Chester Beatty papyri and the New Testament citations in some works of Origen, are codices W and Theta, some 20 minuscules, and the Palestinian Syriac, Old Armenian, and Old Gregorian versions. We've got lots to look at and choose from. The Antiochian, or rather the Old Antiochian text type, has not been isolated among Greek manuscripts, but it is the one to which the Old Syriac version belongs, and it is therefore a reasonable inference that the Greek text from which that version was made was of this type. It had close affinities with the Western text. The Western text was widely diffused in the early Christian centuries and is represented not only in several manuscripts, the chief of which is Codex D, and versions in particular the Old Latin, but also in citations in a large variety of writers as the African fathers Tertullian, Cyprian, and Augustine, the Latin translation of Irenaeus, and remarkable enough, Clement of Alexandria. The chief characteristic feature of the Western text is its tendency to expansion. To this text, for example, belongs the famous insertion in the debate about Sabbath keeping in Luke 6, where certain between verses 4 and 5, Codex D adds, "The same day, beholding a certain man working on the Sabbath, he said to him, Man, if indeed thou knowest what thou art doing, blessed art thou. But if thou knowest not, accursed art thou, and a transgressor of the law." When days of peace came to the church in the 4th century, and a strong tendency to centralization set in, the new imperial capital of Constantinople, the former Byzantium, exercised great influence of the whole of Greek-speaking Christendom. One feature of this tendency was the dissemination of one particular type of text of the Greek Bible in place of the diverse local types hitherto in vogue. The text of the Greek New Testament, which thus became the standard text for the Greek Christendom, may have been based on a recension made by the same Lucian of Antioch, whose recension of the Greek Old Testament was previously mentioned. This text has sometimes been called the Antiochian text from its supposed place of origin, but this is liable to lead to confusion with the old Antiochian text already mentioned, and so the new text had better be called the Byzantine text, since it was certainly adopted by the Church of the Eastern capital and radiated from that center. In Westcott and Hort's nomenclature, it is called the Syrian text, and I see this often in the book by Comfort, where it refers to that, see which witness it is, and it's often mentioned as a significant contributor to the reliability of the Bible. Whether it was based on the recension of Lucian or not, this Byzantine text was marked by the same feature which we mentioned in connection with its Old Testament counterpart, the conflation or composite of divergent readings from the earlier text forms. If a textual variant is shown to have risen from the conflation or mixture of two other variants, it is plainly later than these other two. We do that too. A lot of times the later texts are not the good ones. And this conflate type of variant is very characteristic of the Byzantine text upon which the Textus Receptus is based. This in itself suggests that the Byzantine text is later than those other types we have enumerated. The earlier ones tend to be favored when there is some conflict. And there is the further consideration that the Byzantine text is not represented in the translations or citations of the first 3 centuries AD, whereas the other types of text are. Chrysostom in the first Greek father is the first Greek father whose biblical citations show a Byzantine character. He's in AD 347 to 407. The Byzantine text is that represented by the bulk of Greek manuscripts, and it is the text underlying the earliest printed editions of the Greek New Testament, the so-called Textus Receptus, or received text, of which our authorized version of the New Testament is in the main translation. Now, Westcott and Hort believe that the text, which we have called the Alexandrian, represented as nearly as could be attained the original autographic text. In their eyes, this text was marked by none of the deviations which they saw in other texts, and they expressed their high regard for it by naming it the neutral text. But further discovery and study have led to second thoughts on this matter. A number of scholars have adduced weighty arguments for preferring the claims on the Western text to be regarded as a representative of the first century text. You know what I think? Case for case basis. That's what I've been discovering with all this research when it's put together, showing no favoritism. Depends upon the case by case basis. So, certainly the Western text has very ancient attestation. It appears in patristic citations, the early church fathers, earlier than the Alexandrian text does, and in the Gospels and Acts it exhibits a greater number of Aramaic constructions than the other texts do. Aramaic.